A single beggar knelt by a dying stranger on the roadside, palms shaking, traffic hissing, siren lights far away, not knowing he is a billionaire, and what he did to repay her kindness would shock everyone. But when she pressed her thrift store scarf to his wound and whispered, "Don't die on me," the stranger's eyes, hard as Wall Street glass, softened like a secret cracking open. Night had folded over Harbor Avenue in a slick of rain, the kind that made the street lamps bloom halos and turned every automobile into a comet of smeared brake lights. Lena Brooks, 27, single, a beggar by necessity and a poet by stubbornness, hugged her backpack and listened to the economy of footsteps. She knew the neighborhood's rhythm, the finance guys from the tower cutting across to the parking garage, the law firm associates laughing a little too loud to remember they were still at work, the delivery cyclists weaving like eels through puddles. She played these sounds like measures in a song to keep the loneliness from getting teeth. A black sedan fishtailed at the corner, clipped a puddle, and hydroplaned. Just a breath. Just enough. The driver fought the wheel. The sedan skidded broadside and thumped a street sign. Airbags detonated with papery violence. For a second there was nothing. Then the smell. Metal and antifreeze, the tang of fear. Sadie's body moved before her mind did. She vaulted the curb, shoes skidding, palms out. Hey, stay with me!" The driver's door was jammed. She yanked the rear handle. It came free with a wet groan. The cabin breathed out glass dust in the hush of deployed airbags. A man lay slumped, half-turned, a seatbelt strangling his shoulder. Blood seeped along his temple like a red thought. "Don't die on me," she whispered, "because it was what you said to strangers when you didn't have anything else to give." She slid in through the back, cut the belt with the rusted multi-tool she carried for opening donations and defending herself from shadows. Her thrift store scarf, violet once, now a winter bruise, went straight to his wound. He grimaced, eyes opening, pupils steady. Not drunk, not high. Just human. He looked at her like a man who'd spent years reading numbers and suddenly found a poem written in his own handwriting. "You're okay," she lied softly. "You're going to be okay." "Fine," he coughed, voice rough velvet. "Phone." He groped for a device that had ricocheted into the footwell. Zadie beat him to it, thumbed it awake. A lock screen flared. The stock app, ragged green and red sea. The wallpaper, an abstract fractal river of code. A notification banner scrolled. Horizon X Capital, board vote confirmed. Another, crypto custody license approved. Words she'd overheard on late-night talk radio when the hosts turned the world into bets and charts. She didn't know he was a billionaire. She just knew he was bleeding and the rain was cold. "Ambulance is on the way," she said, though she hadn't called yet. She hammered 911. The operator's voice arrived, calm as a nurse. Zadie delivered the intersection, the skid, the blood. "Hold pressure," the operator said. "Help is en route." The man's breathing steadied into shallow, stubborn sips. "Name," he said, not quite asking. "Zadie." "I'm Cass," he murmured, then blinked like he'd told a secret by accident. He winced when a siren bent around the corner. "Thank you, Zadie." "Don't thank me yet," she said, hearing her mother's grit thread through her throat. A flash of memory, the foreclosed house in Dayton, her mother stacking resumes like firewood, the pastor's box of canned peaches that tasted like pennies. She'd promised herself at 15 that when she could not afford mercy, she would spend courage instead. Paramedics peeled the sedan like a fruit. "Ma'am, step back," one ordered, but not unkindly. She emerged into the rain, blood on her scarf, breath fogging under the streetlight. The law firm associates had vanished. The finance boys had rubbernecked and moved on. The city checked its watch and kept going. Zadie stood alone with a smear of red on her palms, a damp backpack and a question. Had she just saved a life, or interrupted the fate of a man who considered fate a line item? An officer asked for her statement. She gave the facts, careful, clean. "You family?" he asked. She almost laughed. "No, sir." "Then you can go. Can I keep—" She gestured to the scarf, half in the EMT's gloved hands, half in hers. The EMT met her eyes, understood the economy of small things. "We'll bag it. You can retrieve it from the hospital if you want." She nodded, surprised at the sting behind her eyes. It was a bad scarf. It was also insulation against winter and, on certain days, despair. As the ambulance doors slammed, Cassian Ward, though the name meant nothing to her, looked at her through the rain-blurred rectangle. A beat passed. He lifted a hand, the faintest salute, like a CEO acknowledging a shareholder who had asked a question that actually mattered. Then the siren pulled the night into a thread and stitched him away. Zadie walked. 3 blocks. 5. Under the overpass she'd claimed as a dry cathedral, she unrolled her sleeping bag and tried to reconstruct the crash as if it were a math problem with an answer that could be solved. What she had: a man named Cass, a phone that spoke fluent finance and technology, a board vote, a crypto license, a black sedan with airbags, a thank you shaped like a promise. What she didn't have: proof that the universe noticed when she did the right thing. Sleep came in micro-installs. In one, she was 10 again, her father telling her that kindness lives on compound interest, the smallest deposits, paid forward over time. In another, she was standing in a glass lobby she had no right to enter, the receptionist's smile as thin as a business card. Somewhere uptown, on the 12th floor of a hospital with spotless floors and a donor wall engraved with names that changed markets, Cassian Ward woke to white light and beeping monitors. He stared at the ceiling, a grid of patient constellations. His general counsel would text soon. His COO would request the revised term sheet. The crypto custody license with the state would lower acquisition costs by 18 basis points. The board vote would greenlight a new line of consumer products in the fintech app. The law firm on retainer would finalize the acquisition of a tarnished rival in a deal the business press would call ruthlessly elegant. He had been dying on a roadside, and a woman with a violet scarf had refused to let him. "What's her name?" he asked, voice rasping. "Who, Mr. Ward?" The nurse checked his IV. "The woman who kept me here." The nurse shrugged. "EMS report didn't list it." Cass closed his eyes. For years, his world had been numbers, negotiations, and the strange intimacy of taking companies apart to make them stronger. He knew how to model risk, buy time, and sell certainty. He had not budgeted for being saved by someone whose net worth could fit in a coffee tin. He pressed a call button. "Get me Rylan," he said, meaning his chief of staff, the man whose calendar had its own orbit. "And call the law firm. I want a task force." He didn't know why he said law firm instead of security firm or PR agency. Perhaps because some debts felt legal and others felt moral, and this one sat squarely at the intersection. He meant to repay kindness in a language it could spend. He didn't know her name yet. He knew only this: repayment would not be performative. It would be structural. It would be the kind of shock the city would talk about in traffic and in boardrooms. The kind that set precedents, not trends. Outside, rain stitched the hospital windows and a signal tower blinked like a metronome over a city that priced everything and valued so little. Somewhere under an overpass, a single beggar closed her eyes against the wind and dreamed of a door opening where no door belonged. By morning, the rain had rinsed the streets into a mirror, and the city showed Zadie a version of herself she didn't quite believe. A woman with a hospital wristband she'd found in the gutter and looped like a bracelet. A woman with dried blood under her nails and a purpose she couldn't name. She rode the early bus not because she had anywhere to go, but because $2 bought 90 minutes of heat and the illusion of destination. The bus hummed past the fintech billboards that turned the skyline into a portfolio. Zero-fee investing, high-yield savings, crypto custody for everyone. A name she'd seen on the stranger's lock screen hovered over an entire building face in steel. Letters Horizon X, like a promise a rich man had made to himself. She got off 3 stops from the hospital and walked the rest, counting breaths the way people with anxiety count coins. The ER lobby pulsed with fluorescent resolve. Her scarf, bagged as evidence of kindness, waited behind a counter where a patient liaison flipped clipboards like playing cards. "Violet acrylic, 1 corner frayed," Zadie said, feeling ridiculous and strangely protective. The liaison handed it over with a smile that didn't pity. It recognized. "That driver's stable," the woman added, voice low as if stability were gossip. "Lucky you were there." Zadie wanted to say Luck had never learned her name, but she nodded the scarf at her throat, and stepped back into the weather. The wind off the bay carried salt and diesel, and the rumor that people changed when you turned your head. She cut down to the soup kitchen for coffee that tasted like burnt ambition and bread you had to persuade your teeth to forgive. A volunteer named Mara, all sleeves and sincerity, slid her an extra banana. "Saw you on the overnight scanner," she said, meaning the EMS chatter her EMT brother streamed from habit. "You were brave." Zadie shrugged because bragging felt like borrowing money you couldn't repay. He said his name was Cass. The moment she said it aloud, the syllable felt heavy, as if it belonged to a ledger somewhere, not a person. Cass? Mara frowned, searching memory the way some people search Google. There's a Cass Ward in the Business Journal. Finance shark, tech investor, owns half the apps on my phone without my consent ticket. Drives something that costs more than the soup kitchen's annual budget. But who knows? Cass could also be the name of my aunt's orange cat. Right, Zadie said, pocketing the word like a dime she'd hand back later. Uptown, in a private room whose walls absorbed anxiety like they'd been engineered for it, Cassian Ward read 2 screens at once. On one, a cardiology resident explained contusions, heart rhythm, and rest in the calm cadence of someone who could write the equations for worry and still prefer to speak softly. On the other, Rylan, the chief of staff whose calendar entries had sub-calendars, fed him updates. The board vote had passed by a margin that would make competitors twitch. The law firm's draft for the acquisition of Archeon Technologies had returned with red lines brutal enough to qualify as art. The state's crypto custody license for Horizon X Wallet had finalized at 7:42 a.m., opening a pipeline to a customer segment his rivals had dismissed as too retail, and that he knew would redefine retail. The machinery of business spun without him, but he felt the lack of one small gear, a violet one, missing from the cogs. Find her, he said, and Rylan didn't ask who. 2 words became a project. Hospital security footage request, AMS unit number. Officer body cam cross-reference. Social graph from the bus stop around Harbor Avenue between 10 and 11 p.m. Private investigator on retainer with the law firm. Small cash grants routed through a non-profit, so the search didn't feel like surveillance even if parts of it were. Cass drew lines no one else could see, then erased them when they felt invasive. He wanted precision without predation, gratitude without theater. Why her? The cardiology resident asked later. Not unkind when she caught him pulling up an internal memo titled Project Scarf. Because debt, Cass said. And for once it didn't sound like finance. Because my father died counting tips from a second job to keep the mortgage out of foreclosure while I wrote code that sold for 8 figures. Because a stranger's hands told my body to stay, when the market might have done better if I'd gone. Because repayment is only real if the principal changes the structure. He had intended to keep that to himself. The confession hung in the air, a filament of heat. The resident smiled with a knowledge that belonged to nurses more than billionaires. Make it count, she said, and left him with a clipboard of restrictions he would ignore strategically. By afternoon, a whisper had threaded through downtown like a push notification people pretended not to read. Cass Ward, the man whose law firm leaked fewer secrets than a submarine, had almost died, and a homeless woman had been the difference between obituary and press release. Someone at the hospital had seen a violet scarf. Someone else had bent HIPAA like a paperclip. A rideshare driver claimed he'd given a woman named Zadie a free lift because she looked like a person standing at the edge of a cliff and choosing not to jump. In a city where information was currency, kindness spiked the market. Zadie felt it in the way a security guard held a door a second longer, in the way a banker outside the branch found an extra smile he hadn't budgeted. She did not trust it. She knew how quickly kindness was repackaged into content. At dusk, she took her usual place near the financial district's parking garage, where the suits loosened their ties and negotiated with hunger. She didn't hold out a cup. She held out a poem she'd written on the back of a takeout menu, the kind of poem that walks into a room expecting to be ignored and leaves anyway with dignity and tact. A black SUV ghosted to the curb, idling like a grown-up secret. The windows were museum dark. The rear door cracked, just enough for a business card to emerge as if it had thoughts of its own. She hesitated, then took it. Heavy stock. No logo, just an embossed W and a phone number that didn't look like a phone number. 6 digits with a symbol she'd only seen on internal tech docs people left on coffee shop tables to feel important. Who are you? She asked the gap of air, no answer. The SUV rolled forward the way tide does, inevitable. She turned the card over. Someone had written her name on the back in a hand that had been taught by private tutors. Zadie, 9 a.m., Harbor and 3rd, dress warm. Looks like a setup, said a man nearby, his breath a ribbon in the cold. Everything looks like a setup, she said, and slipped the card into the smallest pocket of her backpack. The one where she kept her mother's ring and 2 bus tokens for emergencies that felt like endings. That night she slept with her shoes on, which is how people sleep when opportunity might knock and also know how to run. She dreamed of a downtown boardroom flooding with seawater, and of a law firm conference table groaning under the weight of donation agreements that felt like verdicts. She woke before dawn with a sentence in her mouth: "Make it count." She didn't know whose voice it was, her father's, the residents', her own finally believing itself. At 8:59, Harbor and Third wore its weekday costume, coffee lines, cloud-colored suits, a delivery cyclist arguing with a traffic cone, a woman in athleisure sharing earnings advice louder than anyone had asked. Sadie tugged her scarf up, the violet a bruise of color against the morning, and waited. The SUV glided up with the elegance of an expensive automobile that refuted potholes. The rear door opened. Rylan sat inside, neat as a spreadsheet, eyes that recorded and categorized without cruelty. "Zadie?" he asked, as if there were many, as if he were used to the world presenting him with variables he could solve. "Depends who's asking," she said, not moving. He gestured to the seat as if offering a chair at a kitchen table rather than passage into a different altitude. "This is from the man whose life you refuse to let leave. He'd like to talk. No reporters. No cameras. No strings. No strings is what people say when they've braided a rope," she said. But her hand was already on the door, because you don't ignore doors that open on streets that never hold them open. She slid in, backpack clutched, pulse negotiating with doubt. The door thunked shut and the glass turned the world into a soft, expensive hush. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Not far," Rylan said, tapping a code into the console that made the privacy screen rise like a promise. "To a meeting," he added after a beat, and it was the kind of meeting that changed who you were allowed to. Clara couldn't stop thinking about him. Every detail haunted her. The shallow rasp of his breathing, the way his hand had twitched when hers touched his, the flicker of gratitude and fear in his eyes. The city moved around her like a blur. Street vendors calling out, traffic roaring, strangers brushing past, yet she felt tethered to the memory of that night. She had saved a stranger, yes, but something about him lingered, a weight heavier than any hunger or cold she had ever felt. Meanwhile, Ethan's hospital room had become a fortress of quiet urgency. Nurses hovered, monitors beeped, and doctors whispered in rapid succession. Even in his pain-addled haze, Ethan's mind couldn't stop circling the image of the beggar girl. He remembered how her fingers had trembled, how her clothes had clung to her in rain-soaked misery, yet how she had moved with an instinctive, unwavering determination. It was as if the world had forgotten her existence entirely. But in saving him, she had demonstrated a power he had never encountered, human courage untainted by ambition, wealth, or expectation. Ethan drifted in and out of consciousness, flashes of memory blending with imagination. He thought of boardrooms and contracts, then of streets slick with rain and the girl with mud-stained shoes pressing cloth to his wound. He realized that for all his fortune, he had never been touched by true selflessness. Wealth had bought him comfort, influence, and obedience, but not courage, not compassion, not the kind of instinctive bravery that could save a life without calculation. Back in the shelter, Clara clutched a meager breakfast in her hands but couldn't eat. She thought of the man, wondered if he had survived the night, and felt the strange, gnawing fear that she might never see him again. Nights in the city had taught her to expect abandonment, to accept that the world often swallowed the good without recognition. Yet a tiny ember of hope had been lit inside her, a stubborn, irrational feeling that this man, this stranger, was somehow more than a passing shadow in her life. A week later, Ethan awoke fully. The monitors were quieter now, the hospital room bathed in soft morning light. The pain in his side had dulled, replaced by an unfamiliar sensation, a restless curiosity that refused to leave him. He asked the nurse about the events leading up to his arrival, how he had been found, who had helped him. When they told him a young beggar girl had stopped to save him, he sat up sharply, disbelief etched on his face. She stopped?" he asked, voice hoarse. "A beggar, she actually helped me." The nurse nodded, a small smile on her lips. "Yes, sir. She risked everything, rain, cold, blood. Without her, you wouldn't have made it." Ethan's mind spun. The idea that a girl living in the shadows, unseen by society, had preserved his life felt surreal. He thought of his own childhood, of security and privilege that had never required risk, and he felt a twinge of shame. All the money in the world had never tested him, never forced him to act purely from instinct. But she had. She had acted because it was right, because she could not walk away. Clara, oblivious to his survival, continued her daily routine. She scavenged for food, begged when necessary, and occasionally paused to stare at distant city lights, wondering if her life had any meaning beyond survival. Memories of her mother whispered in her mind, reminders that kindness mattered even when unnoticed. And she clung to one small, unshakable truth. The night she had helped the stranger had been the first time in years she felt fully alive, fully human, fully capable of impacting the world beyond her own misery. But life had its cruel ways of testing hope. Clara's shelter faced sudden closure, and she was forced back into the streets. The rain returned in relentless sheets, each drop a cold reminder of her fragile existence. She wrapped herself tighter in what remained of her coat, muttering words of defiance against the world. She had survived worse. She could survive this. Yet even as she trudged through the slick streets, her mind wandered inevitably to him. She didn't know why, but she felt an invisible thread binding them together, fragile yet undeniable. In the Hawthorne penthouse, Ethan pored over every detail he could gather about the girl who had saved him. Security footage from nearby streets, hospital intake forms, even local shelter registries. He wanted to find her. Not for gratitude, not yet, but because a part of him recognized something profound. She had seen him in a way no one else ever had touched the core of his life with nothing but compassion. And he had to know her. He had to understand her story, her world, her pain. The contrast between their lives could not have been starker. He, a man whose wealth and influence allowed him to shape cities, nations even, and she, a girl surviving on scraps and goodwill, barely noticed by anyone but the cruel rhythms of the streets. Yet fate had woven their paths together on that fateful rainy night, leaving questions that neither could ignore. How would a life of privilege meet a life of survival without shattering one or the other? And what unimaginable forces would be unleashed when a billionaire discovered the beggar who had literally saved his life? As Clara curled up under the scant protection of a doorway that night, her thoughts strayed to the man whose face had etched itself into her memory. She couldn't know he was searching for her, couldn't know that the very thread connecting them might soon unravel in ways she could neither anticipate nor control. All she knew was the warmth she felt that night in the rain, the inexplicable, impossible hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the world wasn't entirely cruel, and that one act of kindness could ripple beyond her imagination. The day Ethan found her, Clara was sitting on a worn bench outside the city library, shivering despite the weak autumn sun. She had wandered the streets all morning, searching for food and scraps of work, when a sleek black car slowed at the curb. A man stepped out, impeccably dressed, every movement exuding confidence and authority. Yet his eyes scanned the crowd with something entirely unexpected. Intent, recognition, and an urgency that made her chest tighten. He walked toward her, and Clara's heart thudded with a mix of fear and disbelief. The stories she had heard about billionaires, cold, untouchable, distant, clashed violently with the man approaching her, the same man she had saved in the rain, the one who had haunted her thoughts for weeks. He stopped a few feet away, looking at her with a vulnerability she had never imagined, a quiet intensity that made her stomach flip. "Clara," he said softly, as if saying her name was itself an act of reverence. She froze, eyes wide. "Do you remember me?" She blinked, unsure if this was a trick, a dream, or the universe finally correcting itself. I don't know what you mean," she stammered, though her memory screamed it was him. The man she had pressed cloth to his wound, who had gasped and grasped at life under her trembling hands. Him. "I'm Ethan Hawthorne," he said, and the name fell from his lips with a strange gravity, a weight she could barely comprehend. "You saved my life. On the curb in the rain. You didn't know who I was. But you didn't hesitate. You acted. You risked yourself for me." Her mind spun. Billionaire. Him. Her. The incongruity of their worlds collided with her memories of rain, blood, and cold. I was just trying to help," she whispered. "I didn't know who you were." Ethan knelt slightly to meet her gaze, his eyes unrelenting yet gentle. "And yet you saved me. You saw a man in need, not a billionaire. That changes everything." His voice cracked, almost unrecognizable to her. Raw, human, vulnerable. For the first time, Clara realized that wealth and power could not shield a man from fear, from mortality, from the awe of being truly saved by another. Tears welled in her eyes, and she looked down at her worn shoes, ashamed, yet oddly proud. "I'm nothing," she said. "I don't have anything. I'm just me." Ethan shook his head. "You are everything. You saved me when no one else would. And because of that, nothing I can do could ever repay you fully. But I want to try." He extended his hand, not as a billionaire handing a gift, not as a man asserting power, but as someone offering genuine gratitude, recognition, and partnership. Clara hesitated, the weight of disbelief pressing down on her. She had survived streets and storms, neglect and hunger, yet nothing prepared her for this surreal moment where her life and the world's richest man collided. "You don't have to decide now," Ethan continued, "but I need you to know something. Because of your kindness, because of your courage, the world is about to change for you. And maybe, for both of us." Over the next weeks, Clara's life shifted with a pace she could barely follow. Ethan arranged safe housing, medical care, and education for her, but more than that, he treated her with a respect she had never known. Meetings were scheduled around her comfort. Mentors were chosen to guide, not patronize her. And yet he never imposed his wealth, never flaunted it to make her feel indebted. Instead, he listened. He learned, and in turn, Clara began to heal, not just from the cold and hunger, but from a lifetime of invisibility, fear, and self-doubt. In the quiet moments, they shared stories of his lonely childhood under harsh expectations, of her nights on rain-slicked streets, of dreams deferred and courage summoned from necessity. Ethan marveled at her resilience, her ability to see humanity where others only saw status. Clara marveled at his humility, the ease with which he valued life over power, kindness over influence. And then came the moment that defined everything. Ethan invited her to a charity gala, not as a guest, not as an assistant, but as an equal partner in the initiatives he had begun in communities like hers. Clara, in a simple yet elegant dress, walked through the grand halls, hearts turning not just for the billionaire she had saved, but for the human connection that had bridged impossible worlds. She realized she was no longer invisible. She had altered not only her destiny but his, and in turn, countless others who would benefit from the compassion and courage she carried. As the night ended, Ethan took her hand and led her to a balcony overlooking the city. Lights glittered like 1,000 tiny promises below, and Clara felt the weight of her journey, the nights of cold, the risk, the courage, the faith in humanity that had brought her here. "Clara," Ethan said softly, "you changed my life. I want to spend every day trying to make sure I can change yours too. Will you let me?" She looked at him, at the man she had saved unknowingly, at the world that suddenly seemed infinite in possibility, and for the first time in her life she smiled without fear, without hesitation. "Yes," she whispered, knowing that kindness, courage, and one fateful night on the roadside had rewritten the destinies of both a beggar and a billionaire forever. And in that moment, under the stars and city lights, the impossible became reality. A single act of compassion, a life saved, a heart changed, a world transformed.